I'm going to be demonstrating the slope bind off on a swatch here in stockinette stitch, but this technique can be used on any fabric and subbed in for any traditional stair-step bind off. So let's start right in. I'm going to do a variation on this, which is a graduated bind off in the pattern. This would be like you would see on a shoulder slope bind off. That's the most common place you'd see something like this, where you're binding off 4 or 5 stitches on one row, down and back, and then the next 4 or 5, and so on and so forth, so you get these little stairs. We're going to do a slope bind off that this creates one smooth line that makes seaming a lot easier. So I have a swatch with 20 stitches here, and we're going to be doing 5 sets of binding off 4 at the beginning of each right side row to get this effect, but we're going to be doing it sloped. So you take your fabric, we're going to bind off 4 stitches here to start the beginning of the bind off, and there's nothing special about how we bind those off, just bind them off as normal. So I've bound off 1, bind off 2, bind off 3, and bind off 4. That's my first set. Now I'm going to just go ahead and knit to the end of the row as normal. So far this hasn't been any different than a traditional bind off. The difference comes next on the second row. All right, so I've gotten to the end of my right side row. I'm going to turn my fabric and work back. Because I'm working in stockinette, I'll be purling across this row. And what you want to do is work in your pattern until you are 1 stitch from the end of your row. So I'm purling across here, and I'm going to go until I have only 1 stitch remaining on my left needle. And stop. So I am not going to work the last stitch of my row. I'm going to stop and turn my work. So now my working yarn is coming off of that stitch, that first stitch on my left needle, and the 1 single stitch on my right needle, that's the last bind off stitch from the last right side row. So I've turned my work, and now I'm going to slip one from left to right, and that one that I slipped is attached to my working yarn. I'm going to bind off that stitch that we didn't work over. And it's nice to be able to use that yarn to keep a little tension on that stitch to make that bind off easier. And now we're going to bind off the additional for the next row. So we just bound off, that's considered 1 that we bound off from the second row of bind off. So we bound off 1. Since we're doing them in sets of 4, I'm going to do 3 more. So we did the first one, second one, third one, and 4th one. Now you can see I have 1 set of 4 and the second set of 4 here. And I'm going to go ahead and continue working to finish out that right side row. Okay, we're going to turn and work back. And do the exact same thing we did on the last wrong side row, which is work until you have 1 stitch remaining on your left needle and stop. Okay, so I've got 1 stitch left. I do not work that stitch, turn the work, and then use that stitch that's on my right needle to be engaged in the first bind off stitch of this next set. So I'm going to bind off 4 more. Working yarn is coming from that first stitch on my left needle. And I slip that over to my right needle, bind off 1, and then bind off 3 more. And continue in this manner until you've bound off your entire sloped edge. And here I am on my last few stitches. I'm going to go ahead and bind off the last set as I normally would. And now that I have the final stitch, treat it like you normally would in a traditional bind off. Break your yarn and pull that stitch through, pull it through that stitch to secure your end. So you can now see that I've finished my slope bind off, and if we compare it to our original, you can see a very noticeable difference in how smooth that edge is versus this more graduated sort of stair-step edge. Now, if this was on a shoulder slope, something that I was going to be seaming together in a garment, like I was going to be seaming these two edges together, it's going to, you'll notice it's going to be a lot easier to make a smooth, clean seam with a smooth, clean bind-off edge than it is here. You're not going to have these little bumps on the inside of your fabric. So it's a great technique to spice up your knitting prowess, and it's an easy one to sub in anytime you find a bind off in a pattern that has a stair-step approach like this. And that is the slope bind off.